Next. Before refrigerators, before canning, before freeze-drying, humans cracked the food preservation code over 4,000 years ago, and the answer was a jar of salty, sour, briny genius we still can't stop eating. Next. Pickling is older than the Roman Empire, older than most written languages. Archaeologists have found evidence of cucumbers being pickled in the Tigris Valley as far back as 2030 BC. That's nearly 4,100 years ago. Cleopatra reportedly credited pickles for her beauty. Next. Julius Caesar fed them to his soldiers because he believed they built physical and moral strength. Napoleon financed a 12,000 franc prize to whoever could figure out the best food preservation method, because his armies were starving on the march. Next. That prize led to canning, but pickling had already been doing the job for millennia. Next. And here's where it gets interesting. When most Americans hear pickle, they picture one thing, that green spear sitting next to a deli sandwich, but that is barely scratching the surface. Every culture on Earth figured out pickling independently, and every single one of them came up with something completely different. Next. We're talking 17 distinct pickle types today, from your backyard cookout staple, to fermented Korean staples, Japanese miso-cured vegetables, and vinegar-soaked chilies that'll light your face on fire. Next. Let's get into it. Next. The first thing you need to understand is that there are two completely different categories of pickles, and mixing them up is the most common mistake people make. The first category is fermented pickles, also called lacto-fermented pickles. Next. No vinegar involved. These rely on naturally occurring bacteria called lactobacillus, which convert the sugars in the food into lactic acid. That lactic acid is what preserves the food and gives it that sharp, complex, funky flavor. The second category is vinegar pickles, sometimes called quick pickles. Next. You skip the fermentation entirely and just pour acidified brine, usually white vinegar or apple cider vinegar, directly over the food. Much faster, more consistent, but a totally different flavor profile. Fermented pickles are alive. Vinegar pickles are not. Both are delicious, but they are not the same thing. Next. Now, the classic, the one everyone knows, the dill pickle. Next. Dill pickles are cucumbers brined in a solution of water, salt, vinegar, dill weed, and usually garlic. The dill doesn't just refer to the flavor, it refers to the actual herb, Anethum graveolens, which has been used in pickling for centuries across Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. Next. The modern American dill pickle traces directly back to Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who set up pickle barrels on the streets of New York City's Lower East Side in the late 1800s. By 1910, there were over 80 pickle pushcarts operating in that neighborhood alone. Next. That's the origin of what you're eating at the ballpark. Next. Most commercial dill pickles today, your Clausen, your Mount Olive, your Vlasic, are vinegar-based. They taste bright and punchy. But here's what most people don't know. The original dill pickle was actually fermented in a barrel of salt brine, no vinegar at all. Next. That version has a deeper, more rounded sourness and a gut health benefit the vinegar version simply does not have. Next. Speaking of gut health, let's talk about the kosher dill. Next. The kosher dill is not always kosher in the religious certification sense, though it can be. The term actually refers to the New York deli style of preparation, specifically a pickle brined with garlic and dill in a saltwater solution, without any vinegar at all. Next. True kosher dills are fully fermented. That's the difference between a kosher dill and a regular dill pickle on a grocery shelf. One is fermented, one is not. The kosher dill has that mouth-puckering, almost funky sourness that you cannot replicate with vinegar. Next. If you have never tried a genuine barrel-fermented kosher dill from a Jewish delicatessen, you have never actually had a kosher dill. Next. Related to the kosher dill, and this one surprises people, is the half-sour. Same concept. No vinegar. Salt brine fermentation. Next. But the half-sour is pulled from the brine much earlier in the process, usually after just 1 to 3 days instead of the full week or more, for a full sour. The result is a cucumber that still tastes almost fresh, bright green, crunchy with just a whisper of sourness and saltiness. Next. Half-sours are a staple at Jewish delis across New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. They are arguably the most underrated pickle in America, and almost nobody outside those communities knows they exist. Next. Now here's one people always argue about. Gherkins. Next. A gherkin is not just a small cucumber. It is a specific variety of cucumber, Cucumis anguria, typically harvested between 1 and 3 inches long, with bumpy skin that holds brine exceptionally well. Next. In the US, we use gherkin and small pickle interchangeably, which drives purists crazy. In the UK, a gherkin is what Americans would call a dill pickle. In France and Belgium, they pickle gherkins in white wine vinegar with tarragon and call them cornichons, which brings us to the next one. Next. Cornichons are tart, tiny, and extraordinarily crunchy, pickled in white wine vinegar, which gives them a cleaner, more acidic bite than the malt vinegar or salt brine used in other traditions. Next. They are the standard accompaniment to pâté and charcuterie boards across France, and they show up in classic French sauces like sauce gribiche and sauce tartare. One cornichon is about the size of your thumb. They pack a punch completely out of proportion to their size. Next. Now, bread and butter pickles. Completely different world. Next. Bread and butter pickles are sweet. Sliced cucumbers pickled with onions in a brine of vinegar, sugar, mustard seeds, celery seed, and turmeric. The result is a sweet tangy pickle that balances out fatty savory foods, which is exactly why they work so well on burgers and sandwiches. Next. The name reportedly comes from Omar and Cora Fanning, Illinois cucumber farmers in the 1920s who traded jars of their homemade sweet pickles to a local grocer in exchange for staples like bread and butter. During hard economic times, they later trademarked the name in 1923. Next. That story may or may not be entirely true, but it is the origin the industry has run with for over 100 years. Next. Here's where the category gets genuinely global, and we are just getting started. Next. Kimchi. If you know, you know. If you don't, buckle up because kimchi is arguably the most complex, most studied, and most nutritionally significant fermented food on the planet. Kimchi is a Korean staple made primarily from Napa cabbage, though there are over 200 documented varieties. Next. The cabbage is salted to draw out moisture, then coated in a paste of Korean red pepper flakes, gochugaru, along with garlic, ginger, green onions, and traditionally fermented shrimp or fish sauce. Next. The mixture ferments at room temperature for 1 to 5 days, then continues fermenting slowly in the refrigerator for weeks or months. Next. What happens inside that jar is remarkable. Lactobacillus bacteria produce lactic acid, carbon dioxide, and a cascade of flavor compounds that shift and evolve the longer you leave it. Next. Fresh kimchi is bright, spicy, and crunchy. Aged kimchi, kimchi that's been fermenting for months, develops a deep, almost funky sourness and gets used in soups and stews like kimchi jjigae. Next. South Korea produces roughly 2.1 million tons of kimchi per year. The average Korean eats about 40 pounds of kimchi annually. It was granted UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage status in 2015. It is not a trend. It is a 2,000-year-old institution. Next. Sauerkraut is kimchi's European cousin. Finely shredded cabbage, salted heavily, then packed tightly into a crock where the natural lactobacillus bacteria go to work and produce lactic acid. No vinegar, no additives, just cabbage and salt. The Germans get most of the credit, but the technique originated in China over 2,000 years ago, possibly brought to Europe along the Silk Road. European sailors, including James Cook on his famous voyages, used sauerkraut to prevent scurvy because it is loaded with vitamin C. 1 cup contains roughly 35% of your daily vitamin C. Cook reportedly had 0 scurvy deaths on his second and third voyages because he mandated sauerkraut consumption on board. That is pickling saving lives on the open ocean. Next. Miso pickles, specifically the Japanese tradition called tsukemono, operate on a completely different principle. Tsukemono means pickled things in Japanese, and it covers a wide family of preparations. The miso variety, nukazuke, buries vegetables, cucumbers, daikon radish, eggplant, carrots in a bed of fermented rice bran paste called nukadoko, sometimes with miso mixed in. The vegetables absorb the salty, umami-rich compounds from the paste over hours or days. No brine, no liquid. The fermentation happens in the paste itself. The result is a pickle that tastes nothing like anything in the Western tradition. Mellow, deeply savory, slightly funky, with the clean crunch of fresh vegetables still intact. Tsukemono is served at virtually every traditional Japanese meal, including breakfast. Next. Now let's talk about pickled jalapenos, because these are not an afterthought. Pickled jalapenos are a Mexican staple that became an American obsession. Next. Raw jalapenos clock in at 2,500 to 8,000 Scoville heat units. Pickling them in vinegar brine does something unexpected. It mellows their heat while concentrating their flavor. Next. The acetic acid from the vinegar breaks down the capsaicin compound slightly, which is why pickled jalapenos have that warm, punchy heat rather than the sharp raw burn of a fresh one. The taco shop standard sliced jalapenos in a brine of white vinegar, garlic, and sometimes carrots can be made in 24 hours. Next. They go on nachos, tacos, sandwiches, pizza, and if you're from Texas, apparently on everything. Next. Escabeche is the broader tradition pickled jalapenos fall under. The word traces back to the Arabic al-sikbaj, a sweet and sour preparation that traveled from Persia to Spain during the Moorish occupation of the Iberian Peninsula, then crossed the Atlantic with Spanish colonizers. Next. Mexican escabeche typically means a jar of mixed pickled vegetables, jalapenos, carrots, onion, and cauliflower, packed together in a vinegar brine seasoned with Mexican oregano, black pepper, and bay leaves. 1 jar covers every flavor note at once. Next. Spicy sour, herbal, slightly sweet from the carrots. It is extraordinarily good. Next, curtido comes from El Salvador and is one of the least known pickles in the American food conversation, which is a genuine shame. A lightly fermented cabbage slaw made with shredded cabbage, carrots, onion, dried oregano, and lime juice or vinegar. Next, traditional curtido ferments for just a few hours, giving it a mild tang without the full sourness of sauerkraut. Next, it is served specifically with pupusas, stuffed corn tortillas, and the contrast between the hot, cheesy, fatty pupusa and the cold, crunchy, acidic curtido is one of those food pairings that feels almost engineered by a professional chef, except it has been everyday Salvadoran food for generations. Next, achar is Southeast Asia's answer to pickled vegetables popular across Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. Thinly sliced cucumbers, carrots, shallots, and sometimes pineapple, pickled in a brine of rice wine vinegar, sugar, and turmeric. Next, the turmeric turns everything a vivid yellow gold and adds a slightly earthy, peppery note underneath the sweet tart base. Achar is served alongside grilled meats and rice dishes, and the combination of sweet, sour, and fragrant is completely distinct from any Western pickle tradition. Next, it also happens to be one of the prettiest things you will ever see sitting on a plate. Next, pickled beets are one of the oldest American pickle traditions, Pennsylvania Dutch country specifically, and they are deeply underrated. Raw beets roasted or boiled, then packed in a brine of apple cider vinegar, sugar, cloves, and cinnamon. Next, the beets absorb the spiced brine and turn a color so deeply purple-red it looks almost painted. The flavor is earthy and sweet with sharp acidity and warm spice notes. Next, there is a Pennsylvania Dutch variation where hard-boiled eggs are pickled in the leftover beet brine. The eggs turn vivid magenta all the way through and taste extraordinary. Which brings us to pickled eggs more broadly. Next, pickled eggs have a bad reputation in America because of the sad jars sitting on gas station counters for an indeterminate amount of time. That is not what pickled eggs can be. Next, properly made, hard-boiled, peeled, packed in spiced vinegar brine with onions and sometimes beets or malt vinegar, they need at least 1 to 2 weeks in the refrigerator before the brine fully penetrates the white. British-style pickled eggs in malt vinegar are sharp and tangy. Next, Amish-style pickled eggs in beet brine are sweet and gorgeous. The technique is solid. The gas station version has done irreparable PR damage to the category. Next, and finally, pickled watermelon rind. The one that surprises everybody. Next, the rind is the white layer between the red flesh and the green outer skin, flavorless raw, with a slightly watery crunch, but pickled in a brine of apple cider vinegar, sugar, salt, lemon, and warming spices like cinnamon and clove, it transforms into something genuinely extraordinary. Next, pickled watermelon rind is a Southern American tradition, deeply rooted in Black Southern cooking, where wasting any part of the food simply was not an option. Next, the rind takes on the spiced sweet-sour brine beautifully, becomes translucent and jewel-like, and tastes like a cross between a sweet pickle and a fruit preserve. It is one of the most elegant examples of whole-ingredient cooking in American food history. Next, so here's the thing. Every single one of these pickles, from the kosher dill to the curtido to the nukazuke to the watermelon rind, exists because someone somewhere had food that was going to spoil and needed a way to save it. That is how every one of these traditions started. Next, salt and acid and time. And 4,000 years later, we haven't improved on that formula. We've just decorated it in about 200 different ways. Next, the pickle is one of the oldest foods humans ever made, and it might also be one of the most culturally revealing. Whatever is growing in your region, whatever spices are local, whatever fermentation traditions your grandparents carried with them, that's what ends up in the jar. Pickles are edible history. Next, so tell me in the comments, what is the most unusual pickle you have ever tried? I want to know if anyone has had curtido with a fresh pupusa, or nukazuke from a Japanese market, or a genuine barrel-fermented kosher dill from a New York deli. Next, drop it below, because I am genuinely curious. If this opened up a whole new category of food for you, hit the like button and share it with someone who thinks a pickle is just that green thing next to a burger. Next, and make sure you're subscribed because next week we're getting into fermentation on a completely different level. Every fermented drink on the planet, from kefir to kvass to tepache, ranked and explained. You don't want to miss that one.